This lecture is a wrap-up for our semester in second language development. So for the second half of the semester, we had a variety of questions that I would like to address and point directions to what all this means as teachers. The first question I'm going to deal with is, what outcomes can we expect for our learners? And by outcomes, I mean, what is the potential end state for our learners? And we had a couple of readings that addressed this issue. The first obvious answer is that the learner has multi-competence or bilingualism and not native-likeness. I think it's a fallacy for us to believe that we are trying to make native-like learners, because learners now have a complex dynamic language system with 2 or more languages in it. So fundamentally, there is a difference in end state compared with monolingual learners. And it's important to think about the relationship between the learner's bilingualism and the environment. That is to say, to what extent does the environment actively maintain or continue to develop both the first and the second language? You know, when we think about the different types of bilingual learners that there are learners who are learning 2 languages equally as children. There are late onset bilinguals where learners have come to a country during their teenage years and they're learning a second language for one set of purposes, but perhaps they use the first language for a different set of purposes at home. So there are definitely environmental factors that one has to consider in terms of first language maintenance or development and second language development. The other outcome we need to think about is fossilization, that it's inevitable for most adult learners. Fossilization should be viewed as both a process and a product, and it occurs despite intentioned effort and even felicitous language learning environments. Additionally, fossilization is localized. It affects different aspects of different language dimensions across different learners. So you can have 2 learners from the same language background, and while there may indeed be similarities in fossilization, there may very well also be differences. Fossilization can also be subtle, and it appears in how a learner uses various target-like options compared to monolingual speakers. So this gets at the idea that on the surface, the second language learner can be target-like in the way they produce a certain grammar of a sentence, because that is one of 5 different options that a monolingual speaker might use. However, monolingual speakers might have different preferences for different structures, also correct, given certain discourse triggers. And so what do I think about as a teacher? Well, as a teacher, I'm mindful that I am making an already complex system more complex. I think it's very easy for us as teachers to get very reductive with our methodology and think that there is some kind of straightforward cause and effect that should happen, but it is not anywhere near as reductive as we could ever hope. We are making an already complex system more complex, and I think if you're mindful of that, it helps you set your expectations over the long haul as a teacher. And it helps you reprioritize perhaps where your motivations are and your areas of interest are, and ways of looking at your language learners. I have little direct control over how the mind manages 2 or more languages in my learners, all right, or where it fossilizes. So I don't have a lot of control over many of the processes that actually happen during language acquisition. It's very important to be mindful of this. Another question we had was, how do learners differ from one another? And this is getting at this theme of individual differences, which is very often explored. Why do some learners get ahead where other learners do not? And it's true. The data bears out that some learners develop more and other learners do not develop. And this search into individual differences is kind of a quest to resolve why these learning outcomes actually occur. So, based on those readings, we saw that people differ according to age, also personality, motivation, and these are just some of them. All right? I think it's important to keep in mind that there doesn't seem to be any unitary thing called language aptitude per se, and that it's a composite of traits. I think it was Dornier who said that. This idea of language aptitude is a popular idea, and I think we need to be very, very cautious of it because, quite frankly, the data doesn't exactly bear out. So from our readings, what does all this mean for teachers? Well, first of all, younger is not necessarily better. And we saw from the Lightbound article that learning environment matters. And unless a young child is exposed continually to large amounts of communicative circumstances, as in a second language learning environment rather than a foreign language learning environment, then this idea of younger equals better does not necessarily bear out. We also saw from that article that there are cognitive advantages to being somewhat older than young for solving problems metalinguistically. Better also does not necessarily mean easier. Younger learners have difficulty too. They still have problems to solve. They still must go through developmental stages as well. Better seems to be this surrogate term for more target-like in the long run, and I think it's really important that we do not conflate those ideas. This issue of individual differences really comes across to me as a set of secondary factors, and they really bring with them more questions than answers for me. What I recognize from research on individual differences is that some individual strategies, learners can employ individual strategies, or they have particular personality traits that actually increase the amount of engagement with or the depth of processing of language experiences. And so there's kind of this basic relationship is that individual differences really translates into time on task and depth of processing. Are there differential effects across linguistic or communicative competence subsystems? Possibly. I mean, if you think about it, what does a studious introvert gain? Well, that person is not out having time on task in social interactive circumstances. Perhaps, depending upon how that learner is experiencing the language in their own language-related episodes, they may come across with differential results. How do they mentally rehearse language in their minds? And you compare that with the gregarious extrovert. Does that gregarious extrovert necessarily end up with more target-like or fluent or complex language? Are there some aspects of vocabulary or grammatical systems that become more developed or less developed? Well, that's all based on the types of learning environments or language use environments that the learner puts themselves in. There was a study in 1975 by Lily Wong Fillmore where she evaluated 5 child learners of a second language. And she was investigating their learning patterns. And her conclusion was that the one learner who happened to use more formulaic sequences also happened to be a learner that put herself in more social situations. And so, this I think is a nice little illustration of how a personality trait puts the learner into certain language practice or language use environments, and as a result, there is a dimension of their language system that changes. The long and short of it is that environment is key for both considerations, whether it be age or individual differences of whatever kind. And the fact of the matter is that, as a teacher, you can't control your learner's age, and you can't control whether somebody is an introvert or an extrovert. The only thing that a teacher can do is manipulate the language use environment. And hopefully, perhaps through some kind of social relationship with that learner, help mediate the learner's relationship with that environment. Change that learner's orientation with the language learning environment. But again, these factors are kind of secondary, which is that the brain has to be interacting with the language learning environment in the first place, and there has to be enough language data in that environment and opportunities for language use. So to reiterate, really the only place of control is in the relationship with the learner, and most importantly, what the learning environment can provide for the learner. Now, this is, of course, perhaps something to think about whether you're in a second language environment or a foreign language environment, because let's face it, in a foreign language environment, you, the teacher, may be the most important source of language use in a learner's day, whereas in a second language environment, the learner has opportunities for, although may not necessarily take advantage of, learning opportunities beyond the classroom. So once again, it's a question of exposure. We also had a question on how we collect and interpret evidence of language development. We're all engaged in this process of teaching, or rather learning making, and we have to kind of document evidence of our effectiveness, or at least of the learner's development. Whether we're effective or not, it's that's an open question. And this really gets down to the question of assessment. All right, part of the teaching process, part of the pedagogical process, has to involve assessment. And I think we just have to think about this, and this is where I was hoping our data collection and data analysis experience would lead us, is that the types of assumptions we make about the current state of a language learner or how a learner grows is dependent on, first, the way we elicit data. Second, the type of data we actually elicit. And third, how we code and interpret that data. And fourth, how that assessment and that data relates to our teaching practices in the first place. So that is to say, items 1, 2, and 3, are they aligned with our task-based language teaching or our communicative approach, or are they aligned with our more form-focused approach? It's basically getting at this transfer-appropriate processing idea. Okay? Because that's where we base our evidence of effectiveness, or our judgments about effectiveness. And so what does this mean? Well, you need to keep in mind that data collection and interpretation is fundamentally a process of inclusion and exclusion. We include some data, some evidence, and we exclude some evidence. Right? I would argue that the best thing for teachers to do is to have multiple ways of sourcing evidence from their learners, multiple types of assessments. Because language is complex, we need to have a battery, not just one test, but a battery of tests to really get as full a picture as possible. I think it's also important for us to keep in mind that the absence or the avoidance of some types of data on the part of the learner, that is to say, if the learner doesn't produce some language, rather than the learner just getting it wrong, but actually doesn't produce that language, that can be just as open to interpretation as the data you actually see on the page. Okay. And I already made my point about making sure your teaching beliefs and your beliefs about what language is, all of that is aligned with your assessment. What makes some aspects of language more difficult to acquire than others? This is actually a really big issue, and I regret not having a lot of time to delve into this, because I think this is where your knowledge as a teacher about the structure and semantics of your target language matter. You need to know about your target language, and you need to know about it deeply. Right? Because when you know about the target language and all of its dimensions, that's where you are in a better position to see where a learner is having struggle, and you are able to make decisions about how you are going to act. Now, just because you decide to act doesn't mean it's necessarily going to have an effect. All right, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So first of all, what makes some aspects of language more difficult to acquire than others? Well, first, semantic or formal complexity that is inherent in some constructions but not others. This affects learnability. I think Monica Eckiert's article about the article system is a nice example. The article by Ellie Hinkle on the passive is another nice example. And you see that it's not only the form that is complex, but also the semantics are complex. They're abstract. And all of these things come to play in whether a language structure is more easily acquired than others. In addition to what is inherent in the language structure itself, it's how does that language structure appear in the input. That is to say, there is a frequency function, a salience function, and a variability function. You know, all these things kind of get tied to this idea of what's called robustness, input robustness. And that affects learnability. The L1, L2 relationships. That is to say, whether something is marked or unmarked in the first versus the second language, and how that markedness relates to one another. That affects learnability. But that's on a structure by structure basis. So what does this mean for teachers? Well, as teachers, you can't affect semantic or formal complexity. You can affect frequency or salience or the variability to some extent with the language that the learner is exposed to. But you are working against L1, L2 relationships. You don't have any control of that. You don't have any control over the complexity or abstractness, as I said. And you don't actually have a whole lot of control over this explicit-implicit interface in the learner's mind. Keeping in mind that we can make something in the learning environment explicit to the learner. Well, when we make it explicit, that is one form of knowledge. It's explicit knowledge, but does that necessarily translate into the implicit performance knowledge that a learner needs for communicating in a language? Does instruction affect language development? Well, I guess the question we have is, what do we mean by instruction? Does instruction involve just like setting up many communicative situations? Or is instruction form-focused? Or is it both? Is it learner-centered? Is it teacher-centered? I think, this question of instruction without qualification is problematic. I think we have to really delve into, in order to answer this question, we have to get much more fine-grained in terms of what are the learner's experiences. And then I also have to ask the question of what dimension of language development or dimensions are we measuring in order to answer this question. So I have kind of just a basic graphic. So I had done a survey of Rod Ellis's huge book on second language acquisition. And across that book, I looked at the various themes in order to answer this question for specifically form-focused instruction. But I think the themes that we present here are also relevant to other types of instruction as well. And you can see that the way I've thought about the SLA course is kind of tied into this. So Does form-focused instruction work better than naturalistic learning? In general. It comes down to, in some part, the language target, and this is where we have our question of learnability. Some aspects of the linguistic spectrum are more challenging inherently than others. The next issue comes down to learning environment. Is form-focused instruction taught in conjunction with some kind of communicative supplement? Because it has been found in studies that, yes, form-focused instruction does work, but, keeping in mind the language target, it works when there is some kind of communicative experiences that go along with it. The next question again is related to language environment. Do learners have large quantities of exposure to naturalistic language use outside of that form-focused instruction? So in addition to having some kind of communicative task inside the classroom, can they walk outside of the classroom and still get even large amounts of naturalistic exposure? Then of course we have the delivery mode. Okay, that is, there are various techniques that you can apply in form-focused instruction. Input enhancement, for example, output rote drills, those kinds of things. You can do the present, practice, and produce, PPP. There's all kinds of delivery modes for form-focused instruction, and those will have differential effects when you take into consideration all of these other things. Is there corrective feedback? Well, it's been shown that yes, corrective feedback is helpful at times, depending upon all of these other things, but also the timing of the corrective feedback. Giving corrective feedback in the middle of a conversation isn't likely to go anywhere. Instruction time. How much instructional time does the learner get? And remember, just because a learner spends 20 hours in class as opposed to 5 hours in class, it doesn't mean that those 20 hours are necessarily beneficial unless we keep in consideration these other things. There comes a point in the audiolingual method where that type of practice doesn't necessarily contribute anymore when you're in the 5th hour versus the 10th hour. This idea of working better, again, we have to make sure we control for the nature of the assessment. Okay? That the assessment has to be aligned with the instructional practice in the first place. And there's also this idea of learner relationship. It basically comes down to motivation in some respects. Does the learner identify with the L2 culture? That is to say, is the learner motivated in some way to communicate with some person or some aspect of the L2 culture? So there is a motivational dimension to this. But quite frankly, it's like if you don't care about French anything, you don't care about French people, then why would you ever be motivated to learn French in the first place? So ultimately, this idea of identification comes down to motivation. And of course, motivation can be expressed in other terms besides culture. It can be expressed in just a sheer joy of solving puzzles. It doesn't necessarily have to be culturally based. It can be just solving linguistic puzzles, and that might be something of interest in and of itself. So these are all factors that Rod Ellis identified in his book, and there are certainly some more, but I just want to reiterate the message. What social processes and constructs mediate second language development? I think it's important to see teaching as a form of social and cultural process. I would say that, while there is definitely a heavy, primarily cognitive core of learning, absolutely, that cognition and that learning does not happen in a vacuum. It happens in the context of other people and our language learning environment. And so let's just take a moment to think about those relationships. We've spent a lot of the semester thinking about what's going on inside the mind, but we now have to bridge outwards. And the essence is this: we're a social species. Our minds are wired to transmit and receive information from other human beings. We are wired to learn from one another. And so I have to ask you, do you see language learning as different from other types of social or cultural practice? Can you see language learning as a type of social or cultural practice? Can you bring your own teaching practice to be in line with other types of social and cultural learning? Do you treat language learning or language teaching as different from other types of social or cultural practice? So I keep asking, how do we learn other things, especially in non-school environments? We have relationships, we have mentors, we have friends, we communicate, we learn skills from them to live our lives. And it's true, I think formal pedagogy has strengths, but not everything gets learned through formalized pedagogy. Not everything has to be learned through formalized pedagogy. And I think that the communicative language teaching and task-based language teaching, they all kind of embody this idea of what was formerly perceived as a formal learning environment isn't necessarily the best. That there needs to be social interaction. Okay, and so this is where I ask, especially for those of you who come from countries where there's a very robust idea of what formal pedagogy should be, is where can formal pedagogy take a back seat? Can you see perhaps some kind of culturally appropriate other way for language learning to happen? And I say culturally appropriate because I don't want necessarily export American-centric or Anglo-centric ideas to other countries. I think it's pretty well known in the field that where teaching is concerned, it's important that the practice of teaching and learning is somehow a good fit for the culture. That said, it's important to keep in mind that maybe those perceptions of teaching and learning based on experiences of schools may not necessarily be good for language learning. But I need to open up that discussion in your minds for yourselves. The point is that sociocultural theory is a really good theory, I think, for capturing this dynamic between individual cognition and other human beings and cultural practice. And that's where I believe, as I said earlier in the semester, where sociocultural theory comes in. I think it's great for capturing the teaching-learning relationship. It may not have enough descriptive power at this time for just describing learning. At the beginning of the semester, I created a metaphor for you to consider about the processes and product of language learning. And I think at this point, I would be very interested to hear from you what you think an appropriate metaphor for language development is. I know I've spent a fair amount of time in this lecture talking about teaching, but I'd like to get back to this learning question because ultimately it's your view and understanding of learning that is going to influence how you teach. And I think it's important that you have a metaphor. So I'll just finish off by saying quite simply, again, what's your metaphor for language development?